Outside, a winter wind scratches at the ancient walls. So tonight, we journey back to a forgotten corner of medieval Britain, a land scarred by centuries of unending conflict. The volatile borderlands that lay between the emerging power of the Scottish Gaels and the expanding reach of the English forces. This was not a realm of grand, decisive battles and heroic, shining knights as perhaps you might imagine when picturing medieval times. The reality of a medieval life on this frontier was far more nuanced. A brutal, lawless stretch of land where merely existing was a constant, quiet struggle for survival. We will gently explore the relentless cross-border raids, the deep-seated animosities that simmered for generations, and the devastating, personal cost borne by those caught in the unforgiving grip of this perpetual, whispering violence. This is the story of the quiet rhythms that shaped lives centuries ago. This is the story of a grim reality where merely existing on the Saxon-Gael border was, for many, a slow, inevitable death sentence. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always intriguing to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps light an incense or two for that soothing fragrance. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture a land woven from ancient forests, rolling hills, and the winding paths of cold rivers. This was the borderland, a vast, often sparsely populated canvas where two distinct ways of life, two different understandings of the world, gently pressed against each other. It was here that the seeds of conflict, subtle at first, then growing into a dense thicket of animosity, were steadily sown. On one side, to the north and west, lived the Scottish Gaels. Their society moved to a different beat, a rhythm rooted deeply in the clan. Life was structured around kinship, loyalty, and the intricate web of family ties. Their language, Gaelic, was the whisper of the wind through the glens, carrying tales of ancestors and ancient rites. Their legal customs, often referred to as Brehorn law and some iterations of Celtic tradition, were deeply personal, based on restitution and communal understanding, rather than the more rigid, centralized systems emerging elsewhere. These were a people with a proud warrior tradition, where personal valor and the defense of one's kin were woven into the very fabric of daily life. They held ancient claims to lands that stretched south of what would become the later, more defined border, viewing these territories as their rightful ancestral domains. Across the shifting lines, to the south and east, were the Anglo-Saxons, and later, the English. Their world was ordered by the weight of a different structure, the feudal system. Land was held in return for service, a hierarchy that stretched from king to peasant, each bound by duty and allegiance. English common law, with its formalized courts and written statutes, was a slow, steady tide, gradually shaping a more unified legal landscape. Their identity, too, was quietly evolving, consolidating into a distinct English nation, with its gaze often cast northward, seeing opportunity and, perhaps, a need for control. Between these two worlds, like anchors on a stormy sea, were the Marcher lords. These powerful feudal figures, granted significant autonomy by their respective kings, were the sharp edges of royal power. They were given special powers, broad swathes of land, and the implicit understanding that their role was to defend, and subtly, to expand the dominion of their kingdom. They were often a law unto themselves, their personal ambitions and rivalries adding another layer of quiet complexity to the simmering tensions of the border. The very land itself seemed to conspire in this unfolding drama. It was a rugged, often unforgiving canvas, high hills that offered natural defenses and hidden paths, dense forests that provided cover for swift movement, and numerous rivers that could be both barrier and highway. This very terrain, while beautiful in its starkness, made it a land ideal for swift, unseen raids, and incredibly difficult for any central authority to truly control. Yet, control over these lands, particularly strategic points like the strongholds of Berwick or the ancient city of Carlisle, was vital. They were gateways, economic arteries, and symbols of dominion, leading to an ongoing, gentle tug-of-war for territorial dominance. The roots of this quiet conflict stretch back through the mists of time, long before the familiar names of England and Scotland truly took shape. The withdrawal of the Roman legions centuries earlier had left a subtle void, a fertile ground for new powers to rise. The subsequent Anglo-Saxon invasions, a slow, relentless push, gradually pressed the native Britons north and west, laying down early lines of division that would deepen over time. From this shifting landscape emerged distinct proto-kingdoms, Northumbria, reaching deep into what is now southern Scotland, Strathclyde, a Brittonic kingdom with its own unique heritage, and eventually, the Kingdom of Scotland itself. Even in these early days, before the Norman conquest, the whispers of skirmishes and raids, the quiet acts of aggression between these nascent nations, were already echoing across the borderlands. Then came the Norman conquest in 1066, a seismic shift that, while far to the south, sent gentle ripples northward. The consolidation of English power under a strong Norman monarchy led to more organized, albeit still measured, attempts to assert control over the northern territories. In response, the Scottish kings, themselves a blend of Gaelic and Norman influences, quietly resisted this encroaching dominance, occasionally venturing south to assert their own claims or to test the resolve of their English neighbors. It was in this dynamic, this constant, gentle push and pull, that the debatable lands truly emerged, vast tracts of territory where sovereignty was a perpetually contested concept, where neither crown held undisputed sway. This ambiguity fostered a pervasive lawlessness, a quiet chaos that would define life for centuries. The differing legal systems, more than just abstract concepts, became subtle friction points in daily life. The clash between the clan law of the Gaels, with its emphasis on custom, oral tradition, and collective responsibility, and the more formalized, written feudal and common law of the English, often led to profound misunderstandings and fueled disputes. A cattle raid, seen by one side as a legitimate act of restitution under ancient custom, was viewed by the other as a clear act of theft and an affront to the king's law. These differing interpretations of justice, of property, and of retribution created a quiet, persistent hum of unresolved grievances. Economic disparities also played a gentle but persistent role. For communities living on the edge, periods of scarcity, a harsh winter, or a failed harvest could make the thought of quick wealth across the border irresistibly tempting. Cattle, often the primary form of wealth in these agrarian societies, were a constant law. Goods and even people, taken for ransom or into servitude, represented a means of survival, or perhaps a way to gently climb the precarious ladder of border life. And so, a cycle began, a pervasive rhythm of violence that became deeply ingrained, the blood feud. This cultural practice, where an injury or death to one family or clan member demanded retribution from the offending party, ensured that acts of violence rarely ended with a single strike. Instead, they echoed across generations, a quiet, persistent demand for vengeance that perpetuated the cycles of raiding and reprisal, ensuring that the border, for centuries to come, would remain a place where peace was always a fragile, fleeting guest. The gentle hum of the wind across the borderlands often carried more than just the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. It often carried the quiet, unsettling whisper of what was to come, a premonition of the pervasive reality for those who called this land home. Life under the shadow of the axe. This was a realm where the rhythms of daily existence were dictated not by the seasons alone, but by the relentless threat of cross-border raids, known euphemistically as reiving. Reiving was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a constant, almost ritualized aspect of life. Its frequency and scale varied, from small, quiet incursions by a handful of men seeking a few stray beasts to large, organized movements involving hundreds, even thousands, of mounted raiders, sweeping across the landscape like a silent tide. These weren't grand armies, but swift, elusive parties, skilled in the art of surprise and vanish. The targets of these raids were precise, driven by a desperate need or desire for quick gain. Livestock, particularly cattle and sheep, were the primary form of wealth in these agrarian communities, and thus the most coveted prize. But reivers also sought crops, carefully hoarded food stores, and, most chillingly, people. Abduction was a grim reality, with individuals taken for ransom or, in darker instances, forced into servitude. The distant clatter of hooves over cobblestones, or the quiet rustle in the night, could signal the terrifying arrival of these parties, often followed by the chilling glow of burning homes and farms, deliberately set to spread terror and break the spirit of a community. In this brutal landscape, the concept of justice was often swift and personal. If raiders were pursued immediately, a practice known as hot trod, the retribution could be immediate and devastating. Those captured might face brutal methods of punishment, a stark reminder of the lawless nature of the frontier. The very air seemed thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a constant reminder of the fragility of peace. This relentless cycle of reiving cast a long, cold shadow over the economic life of the borderlands. It was a place where true accumulation of wealth was almost impossible. How could one prosper when everything could be snatched away in a single night? This constant threat led to widespread poverty and subsistence living, always on the precipice of ruin. Agriculture, the very foundation of medieval life, was perpetually disrupted. The inability to safely plant seeds, more agonizingly, to harvest crops without fear of them being stolen or destroyed, led to recurring famines and profound hardship. Villages, churches, and even the nascent forms of infrastructure were frequently damaged or utterly destroyed, hindering any long-term development and trapping the region in a cycle of rebuilding and redestruction. The very act of defense carried an immense economic burden, forcing communities to invest precious resources into maintaining watchtowers, the peel towers, or fortifying their farmhouses into stout bastle houses, and always, the cost of armed guards, ever vigilant. It was a world where resources, scarce as they were constantly diverted from productive endeavors to the mere act of survival. Beyond the physical devastation, the psychological toll was profound, an unseen weight pressing down on every soul. A pervasive anxiety, a constant, low-level hum of fear, settled over the land. People live with a never-ending uncertainty, never knowing when or where the next attack would come from, when the night would erupt in terror. The loss of loved ones, through death, injury, or the soul-searing pain of abduction, was an ever-present possibility. This climate of fear bred a deep-seated distrust and paranoia, not just of outsiders, but even between communities within the border region. Cooperation was rare, suspicion rampant, fostering an entrenched us versus them mentality that poisoned any hope of lasting peace. The boy missed his mother most at night, when the walls stopped whispering and silence pressed in. Law, in its traditional sense, struggled to gain a foothold in this wild territory. The remoteness of the border and the ceaseless conflict made it incredibly difficult for either the Scottish or English crown to enforce their authority effectively. Centralized law was a distant concept, often dissolving into the harsh realities of the frontier. Instead, communities often relied on local lords or clan chiefs for protection, figures who, while offering a semblance of order, often had their own agendas, their own rivalries, further complicating the already fractured landscape. There were attempts, earnest at times, to establish border laws, to forge truces, and to convene commissions between the kingdoms. But these efforts, however well-intentioned, often crumbled under the weight of renewed hostilities or a fundamental lack of consistent enforcement. The border became a haven for broken men, individuals or entire families who had lost their lands, their standing, and their hope, becoming outlaws, contributing another layer to the pervasive lawlessness that defined the region. His hands, always raw, his boots, always damp, but the bread, always warm at noon. A small comfort in a world of biting cold. To truly grasp this grim reality, one must try to gently picture the quiet struggles, the daily heartaches. Imagine a farmer, toiling from dawn till dusk, his hands raw from the earth, his boots always damp. He watches his meager harvest ripen, knowing that a single raid could reduce it all to ash, leaving his family to face the quiet gnawing of hunger. Or consider the quiet agony of a mother, her child suddenly gone, snatched away in the night, her pleas echoing unanswered in the stillness of the dawn. These weren't isolated incidents, but the fabric of life, woven into the very existence of countless souls on the border. While specific individual accounts are often lost to the mists of time, the medieval chronicles and fragmented records that survive paint a consistent tableau of suffering, of communities defending themselves against overwhelming odds, and of the perpetual, quiet struggle for survival against the death sentence that was life on the Saxon-Gael border. A day like any other, but not quite. A day like any other, until the quiet rumble of distant hooves turned into a terrifying roar. The horizon, often a place of peaceful, rolling hills, could transform in an instant into a dark, moving mass of mounted figures. These swift, mounted parties, known as border reivers, move with a quiet, practiced efficiency, their objective clear: to take what they could, and to spread enough terror to ensure little resistance. The burning of homes and farms was not merely an act of destruction, but a calculated psychological weapon, ensuring that even if a community survived the immediate raid, the long-term impact on their morale and ability to rebuild would be profound. The smell of wood smoke, so often a comforting sign of hearth and home, became a pungent, chilling harbinger of ruin. The reivers, in their quiet efficiency, knew precisely what to target. Livestock, the very embodiment of wealth in this agrarian society, was often the first to be driven away. The lowing of stolen cattle, carried on the wind, was a mournful lament for a life's work suddenly vanished. But it wasn't just animals. The meticulously stored grains from a hard-won harvest, the precious few possessions that adorned a humble home, even the clothes on one's back, all were fair game. And then there was the human element, the chilling practice of abduction, a father taken for ransom, a child carried off to be held as a bargaining chip, or even, in the darkest corners of this history, individuals forced into a form of servitude. The absence of a loved one, a silent, gaping void in the daily rhythm of life, was a burden that transcended even the economic ruin. The concept of justice in this landscape was often as brutal and direct as the raids themselves. If a community was able to rally quickly enough, or if a lord was powerful enough to mount an immediate pursuit, the hot trod, then retribution could be swift. These pursuits were often relentless, driven by a deep-seated desire for vengeance and the recovery of stolen goods. When raiders were caught, the methods of retribution were often harsh, designed to send a chilling message to any who might consider future incursions. The cycle of violence, once begun, was incredibly difficult to break, each act of aggression begetting a counteract, a perpetual motion machine of quiet suffering. The economic devastation was not just about what was lost in a raid. It was about the inability to build, to grow, to truly thrive. The constant threat meant that investing in long-term improvements to land or infrastructure was a gamble few could afford to take. Why build a sturdy barn if it would likely be burned to the ground next season? Why clear more land for crops if the harvest would only be stolen? This environment fostered a culture of short-term survival, of living from hand to mouth, always bracing for the next blow. It created a regional poverty that lingered for centuries, a quiet testament to the enduring cost of perpetual conflict. Even the necessary defenses, the peel towers and bastle houses, while providing crucial refuge, represented a massive diversion of labor and resources that could have been used for productive, peaceful endeavors. The psychological landscape was equally scarred. The pervasive anxiety of living on the border was a constant, low-grade fever that never truly broke. Sleep was often disturbed, restless, filled with imagined sounds. The smallest shift in the wind, a distant dog's bark, could send a shiver of fear through a household. Trust, that fundamental human bond, was a fragile commodity. Communities on opposing sides of the border viewed each other with deep-seated suspicion, their historical grievances simmering just beneath the surface. Even within communities, the fear of betrayal, of informants, added another layer of quiet paranoia. This us versus the mentality permeated every aspect of life, hindering any possibility of cross-border cooperation or genuine peace. The boy missed his mother most at night, when the walls stopped whispering and silence pressed in, a silence that felt heavy with unspoken fears. Law itself, the very framework of a stable society, was often a fleeting whisper in these wild lands. The sheer remoteness and the constant ebb and flow of conflict meant that the authority of either the Scottish or English crown was tenuous at best. Royal decrees and distant courts held little sway when a reiver band was at your doorstep. Instead, people often relied on local lords or clan chiefs for a semblance of protection, figures who wielded power through force and reputation, often with their own complex and sometimes conflicting agendas. Treaties were signed, and border commissions were convened with solemn declarations of peace and justice. But these efforts, however well-intentioned, often withered under the harsh reality of renewed hostilities or fundamental lack of means to enforce them consistently. This environment gave rise to the broken men, individuals and families who had lost everything, dispossessed and dislocated, who often turned to outlawry, further fueling the very lawlessness that had created them. His hands, always raw, his boots, always damp, but the bread, always warm at noon. A small comfort, a quiet defiance, in a world that constantly sought to strip away all security. This was the quiet struggle, the daily defiance, of a life lived under the shadow of the axe. The constant gnawing fear, the economic devastation, and the psychological toll were not met with passive resignation on the Saxon-Gael border. Instead, generations of quiet struggle forged a profound resilience, giving rise to ingenious strategies and unique architectural innovations, all designed to defy the grim reality of their existence. This chapter explores the very tangible ways in which communities, caught in the eye of the storm, learn not merely to endure, but to build, to adapt, and to resist the constant threat. The landscape itself, once a facilitator of raids, became a canvas for defiance. The most ubiquitous and telling architectural response to the ever-present danger was the peel tower. Picture a solitary sentinel, rising starkly against the skyline, its thick stone walls, sometimes as much as 10 feet deep, presenting an unyielding face to the world. These towers, typically 3 or 4 stories high, were not grand castles, but formidable, compact fortresses designed primarily as watchtowers and refuges during swift raids. Their windows were tiny, mere slits, offering little purchase for attackers and preventing easy entry, while their single, often elevated entrance could be barricaded with heavy timber and stone. Within these quiet, enclosed spaces, families could retreat with their most precious belongings and, crucially, their livestock on the ground floor, keeping them safe from marauding reivers. The very construction of a peel tower was a testament to the community's desperate need for security, a silent, enduring declaration of defiance against the relentless violence. Alongside the peel towers, particularly common in the English borderlands but with Scottish equivalents, were the bastle houses. These were fortified farmhouses, a crucial evolution in domestic architecture, blurring the line between home and fortress. Typically 2 stories, these structures ingeniously incorporated defense into their very design. The ground floor, often windowless or with only narrow slits, was where the invaluable livestock, the family's wealth, would be herded at night, safe behind thick stone walls. Above, on the first floor, accessed by an internal ladder or removable staircase, were the living quarters, a space of relative safety, but one where even the hearth was often built to be defensible. The very act of building a bastle house was an acknowledgement of the pervasive danger, a quiet acceptance that the home itself had to be a stronghold. Even the most sacred spaces were not immune to this need for defense. Churches, vital centers of community life and spiritual solace, were sometimes fortified, their towers strengthened to act as places of refuge, and their graveyards enclosed by stout walls to prevent desecration or the theft of bodies for ransom. Villages, too, were strategically located, often nestled into defensive positions, or, where the land allowed, encircled by defensive palisades or earthen banks. And towering above it all, the larger castle garrisons, places like Alnwick, Jedburgh, or Roxburgh, serve as crucial bases for military forces, symbols of royal authority, often under siege themselves, their stones bearing the quiet scars of countless assaults. These castles, though symbols of power, were also stark reminders of the constant conflict, their very existence a monument to a brutal past. These architectural responses were not merely stone and mortar. They were reflections of profound social and community adaptations. Life on the border fostered a unique social structure, one where lineage and a fierce independence became paramount. This environment gave rise to the powerful riding families or border clans. Names like Armstrongs, Elliots, Grahams, Maxwells, Scotts, and Kerrs became synonymous with the border reivers, their very names whispered with a blend of fear and grudging respect. These families, often vast and interconnected, formed the backbone of the reiving culture, their loyalties often shifting like the border mist, pledging allegiance to whichever crown or local lord best served their immediate interests. Their existence was a stark example of how the constant violence forged its own form of order, a brutal self-reliance that transcended national allegiances. Vigilance was not merely a virtue, it was the absolute essence of survival. The constant threat meant communities developed sophisticated, yet quiet, warning systems. Lookouts were posted on high vantage points, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, any dust cloud that might betray an approaching party. The quick communication of danger was vital, often relying on beacon fires lit on hilltops. Their smoke or flame a silent scream across the darkened landscape, alerting distant communities that trouble was afoot. Every able-bodied person, from the farmer in the field to the artisan in the village, lived with a pervasive sense of readiness. This environment fostered a profoundly martial culture, where physical prowess, skill with arms, and a willingness to defend one's home were not exceptional traits, but necessities for survival. Almost every man, and often women too, needed to be prepared to fight, to pick up a weapon and defend their families, their livestock, their very lives. Local lairds, Scottish landlords, clan chiefs, or even the notorious reiver captains became the de facto leaders, providing protection where the distant crown could not. Their authority, born of necessity and fear, often superseded any notion of national loyalty, for in the quiet desperation of the border, immediate protection trumped abstract allegiances. But this constant state of defense, this perpetual readiness, came with a human toll. The sheer exhaustion of being constantly alert was immense. Sleep was never truly restful, punctuated by the quiet sounds of the night, every rustle of leaves, every distant dog's bark, a potential harbinger of doom. Resources, which were already scarce, were continually diverted from productive endeavors to the endless cycle of defense. Land that could have been cultivated lay fallow. Manpower that could have built thriving communities was instead trained for combat, perpetually caught in a cycle of immediate survival rather than long-term growth. And perhaps most tragically, the intergenerational feuds became deeply ingrained. Each new generation inherited the grudges, the blood debts, and the conflicts of their ancestors, perpetuating a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end. The weight of history pressed down on every child born into these lands, a silent burden of revenge and retribution. Yet, amidst this unrelenting brutality, there were brief, fragile periods of relative peace. Sometimes, royal marriages between the Scottish and English crowns, or carefully negotiated truces and treaties, would bring a temporary lull in the storm. The weary inhabitants would perhaps breathe a collective, quiet sigh of relief, daring to hope for a lasting peace. But these lulls were often short-lived, fragile as the morning mist. The underlying animosities, the conflicting claims, and the opportunistic nature of the reivers often ensured that peace was merely a pause between the quiet eruptions of violence. Even the reign of strong monarchs, capable rulers who sought to impose order, only offered limited respite. A powerful king on either side might bring a temporary calm to their respective border regions, but this rarely extended to a lasting peace across the divide, and almost never outlasted their individual reigns. The border seemed to possess a will of its own, an inherent lawlessness that resisted even the strongest of crowns. The most significant shift, the turning point that would eventually bring an end to the death sentence nature of border life, arrived not through conquest, but through a gentle union of crowns. In 1603, a pivotal moment in British history occurred when James VI of Scotland quietly ascended to the English throne, becoming James I of England. Though the immediate aftermath was far from peaceful, with the reivers continuing their ways for a time, this singular monarch now controlled both kingdoms. The border, once a hostile frontier, became an internal boundary within a unified realm. This change, while not instantly eradicating centuries of ingrained violence, set in motion the slow, inevitable process of subjugating the reivers and gradually bringing the rule of law to this long-suffering region. The spirit of this defiant existence, however, lives on in the rich tapestry of folk tales and ballads. The border ballads, a powerful oral tradition, capture the very essence of reiving life, their verses echoing with tales of heroism, tragedy, and the brutal lawlessness of the time. They speak of daring raids under the cloak of night, of desperate chases, of loyalty and betrayal. Interestingly, these ballads sometimes romanticize the reivers themselves, transforming them from brutal raiders into figures of daring and cunning, almost like medieval Robin Hoods, despite the very real and brutal reality they inflicted upon their victims. These quiet, melancholic songs are a vital window into the soul of a people who lived under constant threat, their resilience and their defiance preserved in the gentle echo of a long-forgotten tune. In the relentless crucible of the Saxon-Gael border, where life itself was a fragile flicker, survival was not merely about enduring. It was an active, often brutal, endeavor. The constant threat of the axe, both literal and metaphorical, forced inhabitant to master a delicate dance between quiet, calculated violence and the subtle art of negotiation. This chapter delves into the specific methods and practices that became the grim tools of survival, illustrating how warfare and a unique form of localized diplomacy shaped the daily existence of those caught in the perpetual conflict. The very nature of conflict on the border was fundamentally different from the grand-scale battles often depicted in history. This was not the clash of massive armies on open fields, but rather a world dominated by skirmishing and raiding tactics. The reivers, the quintessential border warriors, were masters of light cavalry, their small, hardy ponies known as galloways perfectly suited to the rugged, broken terrain. These mounts allowed for incredible speed and agility, enabling swift incursions and even swifter retreats, vanishing into the mist and hills before any significant counterforce could be mustered. Their weapons were practical, designed for efficiency in close-quarters combat. The lance or spear for initial charges, the long-bladed sword or broadsword for hacking through close formations, and often, the dagger or dagger for the grim finality of hand-to-hand struggle. Crucially, they were also adept with the bow and arrow, providing a ranged threat that could sow confusion and pick off targets from a distance. Their armor, if they wore any, was typically light, often consisting of a simple leather jacket or padded coat, prioritizing mobility over heavy protection, a clear indication of their preferred fighting style. The effectiveness of these tactics lay in their unpredictability and speed, making organized defense incredibly challenging for settled communities. Beyond the individual raider, the border clans themselves functioned as formidable military units. Loyalty to kin was paramount, fostering a fierce cohesion that made them incredibly effective in their raiding and defensive actions. While not formal armies in the national sense, these clans could muster significant numbers of fighting men, operating with a shared purpose and an intimate knowledge of the local landscape. Their leaders, the clan chiefs or lairds, held immense authority, often arbitrating disputes, leading raids, and commanding their followers with a blend of charisma and raw power. This internal organization within the clans, built on generations of shared experience and a common need for survival, allowed them to maintain a level of military readiness that often outmatched the fragmented and frequently unsupported local forces of the crowns. In response to the reiver threat, the more formal military presence on both sides of the border often took the form of garrisons in strongholds like Berwick, Carlisle, and Jedburgh. These castles were vital strategic points, serving as bases for soldiers whose primary role was to patrol, intercept reivers, and protect royal interests. However, their effectiveness was often limited by the sheer scale of the border, the difficult terrain, and the sheer number and mobility of the reivers. These professional soldiers, often heavy cavalry and archers, were better suited for pitched battles, a rarity on the border, and often struggled to adapt to the elusive, hit-and-run tactics of the reivers. The very quiet nature of reiving made it difficult to combat with traditional military might. Despite the pervasive violence, An intricate and often surprising web of localized diplomacy also emerged as a critical survival tool. These were not the grand, formal treaties between kings, but practical, pragmatic arrangements forged out of necessity. Local truces, often short-lived and fragile, would be negotiated between rival clans or communities, allowing for brief periods of peace, perhaps for a harvest, a funeral, or a critical trading opportunity. These truces were often sealed by hostage exchanges, a grim but effective guarantee of adherence, where valuable individuals from each side would be held until the terms of the truce were met. The most formal of these localized diplomatic tools were the day of truce or March day meetings. These were structured gatherings, usually held at specific, traditional meeting points along the border, like Reddenbarn or Cairshopfit. Here, representatives from both the Scottish and English sides, often the wardens of the marches, powerful local lords appointed by their respective monarchs to govern the border regions, would meet. The primary purpose was to address grievances, hear complaints of reiving, and attempt to deliver a form of justice. These meetings, though often fraught with tension and sometimes breaking down into skirmishes, were a crucial outlet for the simmering hostilities, a rare chance for a semblance of order to be imposed. Disputes would be heard, evidence presented, and, in theory, restitution ordered for stolen goods or murdered kin. The effectiveness of these days of truce varied wildly, often depending on the strength and impartiality of the wardens involved and the shifting political winds between the crowns. A peculiar and deeply ingrained aspect of border life was the practice of blackmail. This was not extortion in the modern sense, but a payment made by communities to reiva leaders or powerful border families in return for protection, a guarantee that they would not be raided by that specific group. This informal system, while deeply cynical, provided a measure of grim security in a lawless land, a form of private protection racket that existed outside of any official legal framework. It highlighted the deep failure of central authority to provide genuine security, forcing communities to make difficult, pragmatic choices to survive. The money or goods paid as blackmail were a constant drain on the already meager resources of the communities. Yet for many, it was considered a necessary evil, a quiet, desperate investment in their own precarious survival. The cycle of blood feud continued to profoundly shape the micro-scale warfare in diplomacy. An act of violence, a theft, a murder, was rarely an isolated incident. Instead, it triggered a chain reaction, a demand for retribution that could echo for generations. Clans and families became locked in long-standing cycles of vengeance, with each act of reprisal demanding a counter-reprisal. This cultural practice, while deeply destructive, also provided a perverse form of justice in the absence of centralized law, and it often drove the small-scale skirmishes and raids that defined border conflict. It was a harsh, unforgiving code, where honor and the defense of kin often meant perpetuating endless cycles of violence. The legacy of these specific tools of survival is profound. The unique architecture of the borderlands, the peel towers and bastle houses, stands as a physical testament to the daily fear and the fierce resilience of its inhabitants. The tales of the border reivers, whether in historical accounts or the evocative ballads, paint a vivid picture of a people who mastered the art of survival in a land where conventional rules did not apply. The very language still retains echoes of this brutal past, with terms like blackmail directly originating from these practices. This unique chapter of medieval history, often overlooked in the grand narratives of kings and queens, offers a quiet, fascinating glimpse into the lives of ordinary people forced to become extraordinary in their daily fight against a perpetual death sentence. The relentless fury of the Saxon-Gael border eventually subsided, not with a sudden, decisive end, but with a slow, gentle fading, like the last embers of a dying fire. The union of the crowns in 1603, when James VI of Scotland quietly became James I of England, marked the beginning of the end for the perpetual conflict that had defined this harsh land for centuries. This final chapter gently explores how this profound shift gradually extinguished the death sentence nature of border life, and how the echoes of this brutal past continue to resonate in the present day, shaping identity, inspiring culture, and offering quiet lessons from history. The union of the crowns in 1603 was the single most pivotal event that began to truly transform the border. With one monarch now ruling both England and Scotland, the very concept of a hostile frontier began to dissolve. The previous national animosities, though deeply ingrained, lost their official sanction, and the king now had a vested interest in establishing peace and order across his entire new realm. James I, famously calling himself King of Great Britain, set about aggressively suppressing the reivers, viewing them as a profound embarrassment and a challenge to his unified authority. He employed robust, often brutal, methods, dispatching forces to hunt down and punish the notorious border families. Many reivers were executed, imprisoned, or forcibly resettled, their power bases systematically dismantled. While the transition was not immediate or entirely bloodless, the relentless pressure from a unified crown slowly, inexorably, brought the long era of reiving to a close. The marcher lords, whose power had thrived on the very lawlessness of the border, found their autonomy curtailed, their unique roles made redundant by a centralized authority that no longer tolerated their independent actions. The gradual establishment of law and order followed the king's efforts. With the political will now unified, a more robust system of justice began to extend its reach into the previously lawless territories. Royal courts, with their more formalized procedures and a greater capacity for enforcement, gradually replaced the ad hoc, often brutal, justice of local lords and clan chiefs. The concept of a common law, applied consistently across the former border, slowly took root, replacing the conflicting customs and blood feuds that had perpetuated violence for so long. Roads, once perilous pathways for raiders, began to be seen as arteries for commerce and communication, facilitating trade and the movement of goods, knitting the previously fractured communities together. The slow but steady development of legitimate economic opportunities, replacing the precarious existence of reiving and subsistence farming, offered the border communities a new path towards stability and prosperity. The transformation of the border from a zone of conflict into a region of shared identity was a slow, subtle process. With the external threat from a rival kingdom diminished, the communities on either side of the former divide began to look inwards, recognizing shared experiences and a common heritage forged in centuries of quiet struggle. The very challenges they had faced together, the need for vigilance, the construction of defensive structures, the constant adaptation to danger, had created a unique border identity. This was a people who understood resilience, self-reliance, and a fierce pride in their ability to survive. While Scottish and English national identities remained distinct, the borderers developed a strong regional identity that transcended the old political lines, celebrating their shared past and their unique blend of cultures. The legacy of the Saxon-Gael border continues to resonate in multiple ways, offering a quiet depth to the modern landscape. The most visible legacy is the physical heritage that dots the hills and valleys. The ruined peel towers and bastle houses, standing like silent sentinels, are poignant reminders of a brutal past, their weathered stones whispering tales of siege and survival. Many of these structures, once symbols of fear, are now cherished historical sites, drawing visitors who seek to connect with this unique aspect of British history. The old Roman roads, which had laid down some of the earliest lines of division, continue to crisscross the landscape, now facilitating peaceful travel and connecting communities. Even the subtle undulations in the land, the forgotten earthen banks, and the strategic locations of villages speak to a history shaped by defense and vigilance. The cultural legacy is equally profound, woven into the very fabric of the region's identity. The border ballads, once the oral history of a violent time, continue to be sung and studied, their haunting melodies and stark narratives preserving the memory of the reivers and the lives they led. These ballads are not merely historical curiosities. They are a living tradition, a powerful connection to the resilience and spirit of the border communities. The surnames of the old riding families, the Armstrongs, Elliots, Scotts, and many others, remain prominent in the region, their descendants carrying the weight and pride of a history steeped in conflict and survival. These families often maintain a strong sense of their lineage and the unique heritage of their ancestors, quietly contributing to a vibrant sense of regional identity. Even the language itself, in its local dialects and expressions, holds echoes of the border's past, small linguistic clues to a time when words held a different kind of power. Today, the region has transformed into a tranquil and beautiful landscape, its dark history now drawing a different kind of attention. The tourism and heritage industry flourishes, offering visitors a chance to explore the historical sites, learn about the reiving past, and appreciate the stunning natural beauty that once concealed so much strife. This quiet transformation from a land of death to a destination for exploration is a powerful testament to the healing power of time and peace. The continued fascination with the border reivers in popular culture, in books, TV shows, historical reenactments, and folk music, ensures that their stories continue to be told, often romanticized, yet always hinting at the brutal reality from which they emerged. Meanwhile, academic scholarship continues to delve into the social, economic, and cultural complexities of border life, quietly unearthing new insights and ensuring that this unique chapter of history is thoroughly understood and remembered. In reconsidering the death sentence of border life, it becomes clear that the term extends far beyond literal mortality. It encompassed the death of opportunity, as constant conflict stifled economic growth and prevented communities from truly flourishing. It signified the death of security, as no person or possession was truly safe from the threat of raid and ruin. And perhaps most poignantly, it was the death of peaceful living, as generations were denied the simple comfort of a life free from pervasive fear and the constant need for vigilance. Yet, amidst this profound brutality, an extraordinary resilience amidst brutality emerged. The communities of the Saxon-Gael border did not merely survive. They adapted, they built, they fought, and they forged a unique culture of defiance that allowed them to endure centuries of unrelenting pressure. This quiet, often overlooked, period stands as a unique chapter in British history, offering a compelling example of sustained, brutal cross-cultural conflict within Britain itself, a stark reminder of the human cost of division and the enduring spirit of those who lived through it. The Saxon-Gael border in medieval Britain was far more than a line on a map. It was a crucible of conflict, a land where survival was a daily struggle against the twin threats of rival kingdoms and relentless reivers. For centuries, the personal cost was immeasurable: lives lost, livelihoods destroyed, and communities living under the perpetual shadow of violence. Yet, from this brutal landscape emerged a unique culture of defiance and resilience, leaving behind a legacy etched in stone and woven into the very fabric of the borderlands. It's a stark reminder that in certain times and places, merely existing could indeed be a death sentence, a quiet truth carried on the wind through the borderlands.